You are listening to the Think Brick Australia podcast. Think Brick Australia represents the clay, brick and paver manufacturers of Australia. Brick by brick, our podcast will discuss technical information and architectural case studies with special guests. I'm your host, Elizabeth McIntyre, the CEO of Think Brick Australia. Andrew, welcome back. And I will say this because we had some problems the first time, not with the location or the architect, just with the equipment.
Few tech issues.
So we're back and we're finally remembering how nice it was in Deep End Our House on that day and how beautiful the masonry work was around us. And I'm welcoming Andrew Hagemann from AHArchitecture. I think I've put a new spin on that for you.
You have.
Welcome to the Think Brick podcast again.
Welcome back, Elizabeth. Welcome back, number 2.
Now, Andrew, could you just start off a little bit by giving us a little bit of background about childhood, growing up?
I think I was always spent a lot of time outside building things, which was quite weird. So used to make a lot of cubby houses and my dad's a builder, so used to spend a lot of time on building sites when I was younger and, playing in the bundi pile and making things out of the timber that was lying around on site and, just generally always around building. So, and then I kind of found out a lot later on when I was in my teen years that I had this, unbeknownst to myself, because my dad had immigrated to Australia in the 60s, so from Germany. And so I had all this family history in Germany that I didn't know about. That, we're all engineers and builders and, architects. So there was this very long lineage that I wasn't aware of. So I think by the time I got to choosing what I was going to do as a career, I kind of had a bit of a tech drawing background that I enjoyed, and I wasn't really good at one thing. I was good at lots of different things. So, I think my best subjects were like English literature and chemistry,
So you didn't sort of fall to more on the art side or the physics side?
No. So, I was never going to be an accountant or a lawyer or anything like that. And I think because of the drawing and the fact that I like to, create things, architecture seemed like a really good fit. And I guess basically when I started, I pretty much knew from day one that it was the right choice. So the first few years were pretty amazing, actually, at Curtin University at that time, because we had Bill Busfield and he invited a couple of crazy English guys over from the AA.
I found out about this, yes.
Yeah, so John Andrews and Charlie Mann, who were absolute nutters. And, one of the first projects we did, for example, is they put a map up of WA on the wall, put us all into groups and gave us a dart, made us stand, 20 metres away and throw the dart at the map. And then at the end of it, they said, right, that's where you're going on the weekend, right? Get a 4-wheel drive, that's where you're driving. And we just look at these guys going, you have any idea
Kalgoorlie?
how big WA is? We ended up on a lake in the middle, northeast of Dalwallinu, Lake Moore, which is a really famous salt lake. So we ended up on that. I don't know. It was a crazy project.
And do you remember what was the purpose of that you go out and look at the...
We were designing the Tower of Babel, so it was all about this kind of, mythical architectural holy grails. And as a second year or first or second year student, you had absolutely no idea what that was all about. So, that project in particular, we didn't know what to do. So we were sleeping in a shearer shed in the middle of a salt lake, with no one around us. We're about 30 k's from the nearest station. And the only thing we did is that one of the guys I was with, Andrew Forbes, he managed to bring a set of golf clubs. So we played golf on the salt lake for 4 days and videoed it. We mapped out an 18-hole golf course because the thing was so big.
The Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel. Anyway, that comes into it later but the funny thing is we got back to university and we had to present. We had nothing. We'd done no work. We basically played golf for 4 days. So I sort of came up with this idea that we would, rebadge it into this project about, mapping out space and claiming kind of context and habitation around this golf game. And I remember presenting and thinking, we're either going to get an F here or we're going to romp it in. And I remember John Andrews distinctly, he was very quiet at the end of it for about 5 minutes, and then he went, that is fucking brilliant. And I think it was that point I thought, I'm going to really enjoy this course. Because it was just, and it's only in hindsight now that I'm in practice and I'm an architect that you think, what sort of what sort of thing were they trying to teach you? And I think it was just that kind of open-minded creativity and thinking laterally and, all those sort of things. And I think if you're in the early years of architecture, that's kind of what you're trying to entrench in people. You don't want people thinking conservatively, because that's not really going to lead to creative outcomes.
And you may get there anyway.
Yeah, so it didn't make sense at the time, but in hindsight now it makes a lot of sense, because every time you approach a problem now, and inherently in an architectural practice, you're surrounded by constraint, just so much constraint, budgets, clients, planners, neighbours, all those sort of things. And it's really, I think Howard Raggett or Ian McDougall came to UWA once. I remember them giving a talk, and I remember Ian McDougall talking about liberating constraint. I thought that's a really good phrase, because it's quite appropriate for architecture. Take all the things that are givens, but at the end of the day, the architectural response has to kind of liberate all of those constraints and be its own thing. So, I think it was a whole process over that, 5 years. It took me 6 years because I had a gap year. But anyway, that whole process over the course, you're growing as a person, but also as a thinker, I think. Yeah.
But Andrew, just taking you back a little bit to growing up in Perth, do you think that informed your idea of architecture differently being here in Western Australia?
I think it did. And again, it's a hindsight thing, because I think at the time you don't realise it, but now I certainly do. I mean, our climate, for example, is so unique. And I've travelled to most of the capital cities in Australia, I've worked in some of them as well. And I think Perth, even when you go to Europe and you come back here, you're just gobsmacked by the light is the main thing.
So bright.
You step out of the plane, you get this immense horizon, this huge sky, and the intensity of the light is like nowhere else, I think. And I don't think you're quite cognizant of that when you're a child, except the fact that you played outdoors all the time. So that's another thing that informs my work now too, is the fact that we actually don't reside in our buildings all that much. And West Australians love to get outside. They hate cloudy, rainy days. And we gravitate to the exterior all the time, looking at those sort of things in the work at the moment. I think Kirsten Thompson talks about interstitial space, that space between the interior and the exterior. And I think that is particularly relevant to WA's climate, because as you're growing up, you realise you hover at that barrier between the interior and the exterior all the time. And I think that's a really interesting driver for the work, that you're almost dealing with the space between the walls in a way. So growing up, I think the climate was the biggest thing that impacted on the way we were as kids, because I used to go fishing with mates of mine, so we'd ride down to the beach all the time. And we were even though we're quite spread out and not very dense city, you kind of always gravitated to the exterior.
Yeah.
And then I think with my parents, we used to go camping and things all the time as well. But you'd be driving hundreds of kilometres.
Yep.
It's not like Sydney or Melbourne where you go somewhere fantastic within an hour. We're talking 6-7 hour drive to get to a place called Hopetown where you camp on the beach, So that experience, that's ingrained in me. I think I still have that, now I'm a cyclist and a mountain biker. I just can't, that's my release from...
You're a mammal.
I am. Well, I'm more a mountain biker than a mammal, so I'm wearing the baggy shorts more these days than the lycra, which is a way better look, Elizabeth, I might add.
So, Andrew, just talk to me a little bit. You mentioned you had a gap year. Where did you head? Did you go back to your roots in Germany?
I did, but that was a lot earlier. The gap year was just a year spent kind of travelling a little bit with some mates, and also it was kind of an interesting juncture in the course, because I was a bit undecided about whether I wanted to do architecture at that point or not.
Okay.
So it was sort of at the end of, I think, second year uni. So I'd been through the Charlie Man, John Andrews experience, which blew my mind, but I wasn't quite sure if it would lead to a job.
Wow.
And, being kind of 19, 20, you kind of want to go and see what else is out there. So that's really what I did. But the interesting thing is at the end of that year and the travel and the experiences, I pretty much went, no, you know what, I think I actually really want to be an architect. So I better go back and knuckle down and,
I was always worried if I did that year, I'd never go back. So I never gave myself the luxury.
I almost didn't. But I think I was motivated, to kind of do third year and try and do really well. And then, my best years at uni were my last two, which was fourth and fifth year, because I think it had sort of sunk in by then, and I think my skill level had improved. you can kind of see the end of the road because it's a long course, you know. It's not one of those kind of degrees you think, oh yeah, I'll get a, you know, Bachelor of Business after 3 years. It's like, no, it's life-changing in a way. So you've got to be certain that that's what you want to do, because you'd hate to get to the end of 5 or 6 years and go, actually, I don't think this is for me.
Or the end of 4.
Yeah, you know, so yeah, it's a long journey, yeah, for sure.
And so you finish uni, you get through, and then where do you work for there?
Well, I did the typical graduate thing. I stayed in Perth predominantly, but I ended up working with a few firms that were quite, well, it's funny, one of my shortest jobs was with Bernard Sieber down in Fremantle, and that was intense. That felt like I worked there for 2 years, but I was only there for 4 months.
Doggies.
Well, Bernard was he had this real craft to his architecture, and he was very particular. You know, everything was manually drawn with lead pencil on drawing film, and it was an incredibly intense experience. But I picked up a lot about detailing and things like that, so that left a big mark on me. And I worked with a guy called Keith Tan, who I owe a big gratitude to, because he taught me kind of craft of architecture and detailing skill. And the predominant kind of period I had was with Cox Architecture for about 6 years all up. So I worked in their Sydney and Brisbane offices as well. By that stage, they were doing a lot of museum work. So I was quite lucky as a young graduate to work on the WA Museum Link building, and then Museum of Tropical Queensland, Batavia Museum in Geraldton, and the Maritime Museum in Fremantle. So I had this really long...
You almost became a museum expert.
Yeah. And then I did the typical architect thing, and I just went, you know what, don't want to do museums anymore. You know, so I think I was always destined to head into my own practice eventually. So I did a 10-year stint, which I think is pretty typical, but then I started to think, you know, maybe I could, you know, make something of my own kind of career at this point.
With all those museums, like how did that inform the way you designed? Do you still... Yeah,
okay. I think that greater knowledge of the city and the urban fabric and, you know, kind of urban design and, you know, the broader ideas of what a city might be had a huge impact, because I think, you know, even now we do predominantly a lot of residential work. I still think I look at houses as being more than just places that we occupy, and even more so now, you know, increasingly they're places where we, you know, we're working because we have to.
Yep.
And, you know, I think it was Donovan Hill that always said that the experiments with housing were really critical to the work the larger scale work that they ended up doing, you know, civic and public institutional work later in that practice's kind of career. So, yeah, I see that sort of side of it, and the integration with how a city works and the ideas behind a city and urban culture was pretty critical. And you could directly transpose that back to smaller projects. You know, there's no reason you can't have big ideas with a small project.
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, look, I'm glad I did it. I certainly don't regret any of that time. You know, I met a lot of great people and went to a lot of great places and worked on some great projects. So really lucky.
Just because you were in Queensland for a while there, what did you notice there? What was the most different thing? You know, obviously coming from Perth and WA.
The humidity.
Oh.
So I was quite lucky where I was living. I was in Spring Hill, right across the road from Donovan Hill's office, which was awesome. So they would have, you know, drinks on a Friday afternoon, and invariably I'd end up in there. And you know, looking at their architecture, which, you know, had this really amazingly gutsy response to the Queensland kind of environment, a little bit more kind of sculptured than some of the current work. But you can see where firms like Bakes and Peters have now had this kind of environmental influence on the idea of that Queenslander house in all their work. And yeah, their climate is so different to ours. So I think I nearly died when I arrived there in January, February, and the humidity was 122%. You know, it's just ridiculously humid. So here I was thinking I'm a West Aussie and I'm used to heat. But it's a different type of heat.
It's a different type of heat.
And you're just drenched all day. Like, you're just covered in sweat. And, you know, the amazing thing is you realise then how the architecture then in Queensland and Brisbane and the hinterlands around it adapts to that kind of different, you know, environmental starting point. Yeah.
So you come back, you start your own practice.
Yep.
Is there a project there that you look back with fondness on?
I always talk about that first critical project, I think, that you do. And I done a whole heap of, typical architecture practice, you start with a whole heap of like smaller renovation projects where you're kind of thinking through a lot of ideas. You're actually cramming too many ideas into a very small project.
But you want to show off all your skills.
You do, yeah, with a small budget usually as well. So I think I was approached in around 2013. So I would have been in practice about 5-6 years by then. And then I had a client, Megan, who came to me that had a fascination with Ivan Ivanov in Perth. And I mean, I knew Ivanov's work and liked it, but, hadn't looked at it too closely in a practice sense. And, she was in love with the Hagemann house at that time, which I think sadly just actually after Concrete House was built, it burnt down. But at the time they were looking to either buy that house or one of Ivanov's house. But the issue with those houses, they become incredibly rare and expensive in Perth. So I sort of said to her, look, I realised they had this block in Wembley. They actually lived in the house next door as well. And I sort of said, look, why don't we try and do a new house for you here? It probably would be way cheaper and we could just start from scratch and come up with something really interesting. So, the first gesture with that house was to turn the whole thing sideways, on the block. You had all these double-fronted Wembley cottages and I just went, bugger that. There's nothing like it in this street.
No.
And to Cambridge Council's credit, it was amazing they approved it because it was out there, it was a pretty different house. And we used the grey, the Midland grey concrete blocks, probably the most, basic material that you could find. But I guess I wasn't keen to replicate Ivanov's work, but I could see the sense in it in terms of using it as a thermal mass material. And it does have sculptural qualities, but for me it was like, well, it needs to perform first and needs to have some sort of sense of what it's doing in terms of the spaces and how it's protecting them in terms of the environment. So that house is pretty critical. And since then we've picked up a whole heap of other projects on the basis of that house, which...
And I'm pretty sure that was one of the first Kevin Ball and masonry years.
Well, it was weird because I think it was a bit like the tile one. I don't think anyone was entering it. We had this weird little house. Midland Brick, who supplied the product, weren't even aware of the project. It was that perfect, nice surprise thing, So I thought, we'll put it in Think Brick, see how we go. I think we were up against M3 Architecture, did this amazing building in Queensland.
Queensland.
I've got next
Act
against
for kids.
that. And there was other, luminaries in there as well, like Taylor Hines and Mel Bright. Yeah. So I thought, I don't have a chance in hell here, being from WA. And it did really well, and then Midland Brick found out about it and they were enwrapped with it as well, obviously because we used their product. But, it wasn't one of those overt things where we were trying to promote the product, but I don't think they'd ever seen anything quite like it in recent times. I mean, obviously, Ivanov's used it extensively. That's another influence of mine, actually, Brian Klopper, but more on the brick side. But, yeah, I think that house was the first one that I kind of showed the thinking as well. So we did a whole heap of things on that house. Like the outdoor area is actually right out front of the house, not around the back where everyone puts it in Perth. And it meant to respond to the block and the environment and how they actually lived. I noticed that Mark, Megan and the kids used to spend their entire time in the front yard on the street, playing cricket and just talking to neighbours. And, it's like, well, why would you put the major public space out the back? Doesn't make any sense. So we kind of flipped it on its head, turned the plan sideways, which to me felt really obvious. And there was this beautiful jacaranda tree right in the middle of the block, which was a very mature tree that we kept, and we literally wrapped the plan around that. So, and that served a purpose it kind of created this flanking plan that kind of went further north on the east and west tips. So in WA, that's really critical in summer because the sun tends to actually dip south of the sun arc.
Yes.
So you get this incredibly intense heat.
Yep.
Almost slightly southwest, between about 3 and 5 p.m. in summer. So kind of tilting the ends of the building towards the north kind of helped us deal with that flanking sun. Yeah.
And since then, I mean, you've produced a lot of work that we've obviously kept a close eye on. And even with Deep End House, the way you've used masonry is not only diverse, but in a very beautiful way.
Yeah.
Why masonry? Why brick and block?
It's the directness of it as well that I like. I mean, I think coming from a building background with my dad, I kind of appreciate the tradesman kind of input into every process. Like I love spending time on site. So there's something immediate about masonry. You're not then trying to cover it up or clad it, or it's got this kind of raw, it's low maintenance. I mean, that's the other thing, is that once it's up, it's up. You don't do anything to it. So you need incredibly good brick and block layers to use it. But it's a diverse product too. You've got the thermal mass qualities. It's got a sculptural quality. It's got an architectural quality to it. It can do different things. So the concrete block we use is screening walls, breeze walls, thermal mass walls, load-bearing walls. You can fill it with concrete, so you can create a basement out of it. So it's an amazingly diverse material, even though when you're looking at it as an individual thing, you think, what can I do with that? So it's that Louis Kahn thing, isn't it? The brick wants to be something. And in the case of me, it's the block wants to be something.
And then you've used it just in some of the ways. You might just want to talk a little bit about how you've harnessed that in this current project.
The Deepwater House has had that kind of, interestingly, the plan on that one was derived from the fact that the north was oblique to the side. So it was slightly diagonal to the long side of the property. So instantly we knew we were dealing with this kind of having to deal with the western sun, but it would bring in these kind of angled kind of sun diagrams that we knew we had to protect things like the bedroom windows. So we ended up with some really interesting external geometry related to how we set up the original site plan. And then it kind of then translated to, well, how do you still let the light through? So they're doing a number of things. They're shielding the louver system. So most of the breeze blocks have a ventilated louver system behind them. That's good in two ways, because it can actually give you the breeze, but it also gives you security. So a lot of people are quite cognizant these days of security. And the last thing you want to do is end up with like really heavy mesh screens on your windows. So, by putting the blocks in front, and we kind of pulled them forward of the facade as well to express them. You probably didn't notice that when you were there, but they kind of protrude from the main line of the building line. And they're everywhere on all the louver systems. And then the breeze walls, the sunscreen walls on the bedroom wings are angled, but we use a smaller 100mm block, turn it on its end, because we wanted to bring that dappled light in as well. That's one thing I've picked up through doing these sort of buildings, that when the sun hits it, and you get that lovely, and it can even be like this time of year, deep in winter where you get long shadows, the interplay of the light on the interior is incredible. So, suddenly these materials are transformed. They just become something else. And I know James and his family are he's constantly sending me photos of it and videos. And I think he's on this process of discovery now that he's moved in. I mean, I think you can always look at a floor plan and a model and, you try and translate those things. But it's not until you actually move into the thing and experience it that you start to realise what the transformative qualities of architecture and what it can do.
And also I think because you've mentioned, the light is so strong, to be able to soften it and filter it in a natural way.
Yeah, and I'm constantly experimenting with that. And I guess I'm using masonry as a way of doing it. So it's not decorative. I think if I was doing it purely for decorative reasons, I should be shot, really. It's, I'm constantly experimenting with apertures and what sort of blocks we can use and how we might use them. But also it still needs to look integrated into the whole design. The last thing you want is to look like it's a bunch of elements that have been stuck to the outside of the building. So you don't want your whole house to look like a louver, I mean, it needs to have some beauty to it as well. So it's that age-old thing that you're constantly trying to refine that craft. And look, I reckon I've only just started getting going with it, to be honest. So, I think we've done 4 or 5 houses now in that vein. And they're all very different. And they all respond to their sites differently, especially the site planning. So, it's interesting. Yeah.
No, I think you're doing it beautifully. And it is interesting when we talk about passive design. I mean, it's all very well to say, the house should face this side. But you don't get that choice. Unfortunately, the driveway has to come in somewhere.
And look, most clients don't have the budget to spend huge money on mechanical systems on their house. So I think all architects, any designer really should be aiming to have as much passive solar design in their house as possible, because it comes, the way I see it, it comes with the fabric of the house. So all the materials that you would normally use on any house, you should be able to use in a way where you're ticking all those boxes of the environmental side. You have to do it. I just think that it's an absolute mandate it's criminal not to. So, I think that's one thing I always try to do is get as much of that in without the client really having this perception that they're paying extra for it. So that's really, really critical. And then, look, you get some clients like James on Deepwater House has gone that step further, and we've been looking at, solar arrays, battery storage. So we've got car charging points in the garage. He's sort of looking at the future because it's a long-term view they're taking to the house. We're about to just start monitoring the energy consumption for the next 6 months to see how the house is performing. So we're doing a bit of a POE, a post-occupancy kind of evaluation of the environmental systems, because I'm keen to know how it's working.
Yes.
And I've also asked them anecdotally as I've been there over the last few weeks, how's it going and how are you finding the thermal comfort? And, that's one side of it, but then there's the kind of the technical data that you need to collect as well. So I'm keen to know.
Where do you see, in terms of where design is going and the architect's role, what do you see the challenges for the next 10 to 20 years?
It's an interesting one. I would have thought with the onset of, COVID and the way all our lives have been disrupted that we would see a bit more navel gazing, I guess, about how we live, how we work. And I'm still hopeful that will come into our lives a bit more, because I think we need to be inherently more flexible now than we ever were. I think we all have this, idea, you live in the suburbs, you drive into an office building and, you go up 30 stories and look at the river, and then you go back down the car and you drive. That thing is quite entrenched in Perth, but I think that's changed. And even with these current lockdowns, I think people are starting to think, well, hang on. And the East Coast is the same. People are working from home, they're working remotely. We need that flexibility. Our houses, for example, are more than just houses where we sleep. They're now childcare centres, office buildings. It's quite broad. So I find that, and multi-generational, they need to cater for the fact that kids aren't leaving home because of housing affordability. You might have older generations coming back into the family home. All those things. For an architect, that's just a goldmine. It's like, gee, take a brief, and even a client's brief, and say, well, hang on, what if? And I'm a big believer in asking that question a lot during the process with my clients, is raising that query, what if we did this? What if we did that? So, because I think at the end of the day, the way that we inherently build and live and all those things are intertwined. So you have to push the norms, break the status quo and sort of look at what new forms. I'm a big believer in typology, exploring different typologies for housing. So it may not be that overt in some of my houses because they seem to, allow the occupants to live quite easily, but that's part of the success. Like you've got to achieve that as well whilst you're experimenting.
Yes. Well, Andrew, it's been such a joyful journey watching you, and ever since that concrete house. And I must say, I've been so thrilled about how you've used masonry in such a beautiful way. And in Deep End House, the light and the way that it almost feels like you've put a sheen on that block. And I will show some photos on Instagram about how their artwork looks like you've actually built the house for the artwork. Yeah. And it's just such a subtle embellishment.
That was a beautiful coincidence, actually, the artwork. So I had no idea that the client, James, had all this amazing, because he's originally from Malaysia. So he had a very strong attitude to architecture right from the start. You could tell he knew what he was talking about, and he kind of cited Malaysian modernists and people like Bawa, and I thought, wow, this is going to be a great project. Lots of, and he was interested in landscape, and I kind of had to push him a little bit on what Perth landscape meant. But that was, there were some beautiful moments like that when he brought in the artwork, and he had these kind of like gilded gold frames on these amazing tapestries. They almost look like they're sepia ink kind of images of kind of agricultural scenes, in Malaysia. And, he kind of said, oh, what do you think? And he lent them up against the block wall. And I was like, seriously? These are amazing. And then you look at the light, like you said, they seem to like pop off off the walls, and so I'd try to change the frame, and I'm like, no, not at all.
Both pieces speak for themselves.
Yeah, and they'd sat really comfortably with the material palette, so that was lucky.
I would have just gone with that and said it was intentional.
Yeah, I mean, had it been pop art, it might have looked a little bit different, but it sat really well. And I think as they've moved in and occupied the house, and you start to see how they live, and you get a sense that it's all quite unified now. It has that kind of synergy to it where you think, all right, I've ticked a few boxes on this one. So, but you're always constantly thinking what you could improve too. Like, I'm just so critical of my own work. I tend to still pick holes in the things I would have done differently. So, but that's kind of what you say.
I think that's an architectural trait.
It is. Yeah. So I'm saving that for the next project.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for all your support of the industry. We are now going to go into the rapid fire. Reading the news, a newspaper or online?
Newspaper.
Handwriting or typing?
Handwriting.
For sketching ideas and concepts, would you use a pencil, pen, or an e-pen?
Definitely pencil.
Do you like to read books or listen to audiobooks?
I'd say read. Yeah, reading.
What is important to you, style or substance?
Substance.
Coffee or tea?
Oh, coffee.
TV shows or movies?
Movies.
Antique or modern?
Modern.
Call or text?
Call.
Travel back in time or into the future?
No, into the future.
Exterior or interior?
Oh, I think I answered this the other time. Interstitial, the bit in between the interior and the exterior.
You're the only one who's answered that so far. Video games or board games?
Board games.
Form or function?
Form follows function.
And with relation to design, complex or simple?
Complex.
Andrew, thank you. And thank you twice for doing this for me.
My pleasure.
If you have enjoyed this podcast, please follow, rate and review our podcast. We are always looking for new ways to think brick. If you have an idea of what you'd like to hear about, there's a link in our show notes to let us know.